Good evening. I'm Malcolm Clemens Young, the Dean of Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, California, and thanks for joining us for the Forum Online. Next week, Opera Parallel will present the one-act opera, Sophia's Forest, here at Grace Cathedral. It is the story of a young girl who has recently immigrated to the United States, having survived a traumatic journey through the chaos of a civil war in her homeland. With me tonight are the composer of Sophia's Forest, Lembit Beecher, currently the composer in residence of the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra, and noted for his collaborative spirit and ingenious interdisciplinary projects. Indre Viskontas, a neuroscientist, opera stage director, and science communicator who combines a passion for music with scientific curiosity, and Malaak Malikyar Sills, a leader in the Afghan diaspora, a trustee of the Sills Family Foundation, and board chair of refugee and immigrant transitions. Each year, the cathedral chooses a theme for inspiration and reflection, and in 2022, our theme is connection. We'll be talking about the lasting effects on families of the refugee immigrant experience, the ways in which children use their imaginations to cope with trauma, and how art can help us connect with ourselves and with others. To start, I'd like to introduce Nicole Premont. She is Opera Paralléle's general and artistic director and the conductor of Sophia's Forest. Welcome, Nicole.
Thank you so much, Malcolm. And I will not speak long since we have such a beautiful and strong panel to discuss this event tonight. But I wanted to share and say that Opera Parallèle is extremely thrilled to be performing Lembit's opera Sophia's Forest in the walls of Grace Cathedral, which will really deepen the experience for all of us to be in that space. And I also want to say that we really value the opportunity of hearing you speak about the subject this evening, since this will provide for all our audience a way to really think before they come to the performance on this very important subject and really deepen all our experience. So thank you all for hosting this and for including Opera Parallèle in your series at the Forum. Thank you, Malcolm.
Thank you, Nicole. So good to see you.
Likewise.
Lembit, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how Sophia's Forest first came into being. Like when did you first get this idea, and how did it begin to develop?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. This was a piece that I began thinking about my mother's experience, and in particular, I found a picture of her in a displaced person camp in Germany in 1949. She was born in Estonia in 1942, at a time when the Soviets had just invaded, and then the Germans came in, and then the Soviets were coming back in again. So it was a time of incredible upheaval, as it was through the whole world. And she had left with her mother in 1944 and gone to Germany. And this picture that I found was of her and I think 6 of her friends, each holding their teddy bears. They were each, 6 to 9 years old, and they were holding these teddy bears just in such an intense way, and looking at the camera in such a, I don't know what the right way of saying it is, intense or pure or focused way. I began thinking a lot about the experience of my mother, and then of children in general in times of upheaval and trauma, both about the way that children use play and their imaginations to deal with those experiences, but then also the way that those experiences get passed on. I thought about, started thinking about what the influence of those experiences might have been on who she is today, and then sort of secondarily how that might have affected me growing up in a very different place, hearing these stories from her and to my grandmother, and how that legacy of immigration and the legacy of that sort of upheaval might affect future generations, even my children, not necessarily in negative ways, but in a full spectrum of ways.
Yeah, my mother's father was held in a concentration camp, basically in World War I, And then World War II is a very traumatic experience for my family too. And I do see like little things in the family that are definitely passed down from those traumatic experiences. And I do wonder just kind of when will that fade out? When will the effect of that trauma be kind of cleansed from our family's life and the way we relate with each other? Maybe you can tell us a little bit about just like the story of Sophia's Forest too. Just, I don't know how much you want to give away or if you want to keep it a surprise, but when people ask you about the story, what do you tell them?
Sure. I guess I would say a general thing in the beginning is, though I was thinking about my mother a lot. This is not my mother's story.
Yeah.
And the librettist Hannah Moscovich, her parents had come from, ancestors had come from Ukraine quite a while back, but she was drawing on also her own family stories. I think in summarizing it, I would say it's a story of a girl who we see at 3 stages of her life. We see back in her homeland, having just immigrated to the United States, and then about 30 years later, right after her mother's died, as an adult. And we see her trying to deal with the events of her past, with a sister who has died during the war. And we see her in particular trying to use her imagination to deal with these events. She had been given a music box by her father before he left, and she speaks to it, and it sort of becomes an imaginary friend or something that consoles her. In the opera on stage, the sort of music box is represented both by music box, but then by this sort of sound sculpture of 9 different large instruments that I had built, and get in through this, we sort of get into the world of her mind. And as the opera unfolds, we see her at these 3 stages of her life, and see sort of the end result of her childhood experiences, and I think achieve a type of catharsis, if not, or a type of greater understanding that she achieves by the end.
Is there any response from your family about it yet? Or, I mean, they how much will they know about this? And, what do you think their response is going to be?
So they actually, my mother and father saw the initial sort of workshop production that we did four or 5 years ago. I think they liked seeing it because it was work that I had made,
yes,
as parents do. I don't think my mom thinks of it as being something that's directly related to her story.
Yeah.
And I haven't, at some point I should speak to her more directly about that. But I think, and I'd be curious to know how much of herself she sees in the main character, in Sophia.
Yeah, in a way, it's your imagination kind of presenting back kind of what you think you've received in its own way, Yeah,
it's definitely an act of, or an attempt at empathy and understanding on my part, but it does not come to personal experience. And I think,
yeah.
Yeah,
it's such an interesting question, because there is that element when we write or talk about things everything we do is, no matter how many little fictional disclaimers, the people in this film have nothing to do with real actual people. Everything we do is just so deeply influenced by the people around us. Yes. And it is such, for me, preaching every week about real people, I do feel like I have to talk to them ahead of time, before I bring them up in the sermon, even if they're going to be disguised by a pseudonym or what have you. I would love if you could talk a little bit about just like what it takes to make an instrument. This last weekend, I was at another place, and I thought I'd really like to invent a game that fits this physical space, the park that was outside my window. I'd love to invent a game that was could only work in that little spot. But talk a little bit about just making musical instruments, and what's your experience been like doing that through your life?
Sure. I think I've always liked building things, and often sort of the instinct to build things and the instinct to make music haven't always been aligned. But I was fortunate in this project that they really came together. I think one thing that was important to me from the beginning was to try to find a way of expressing not just visually but also sonically what Sophia's interior world might be, and to try to, even if it's a fantastical vision of what her world might be, to try to put us, the audience, into that, rather than simply seeing her from the outside. And I think the other thing I would say that I wanted this world to have some magic to it. And it's, there are many dark aspects to her story, but I didn't want this to be purely a dark story. And I didn't want the music to be purely somber or aggressive, to have some sort of element of fantasy and this a positive side of imagination. So that was sort of my starting point for creating the instruments. And I decided to use elements of sort of everyday items that were part of her story. So there's 5 bike wheels. She has these very intense memories of riding a bike with her sister, Emma. And then there's these 4 towers that have wine glasses on them. Once they come to the United States, her mother often drinks wine out of these sort of extravagant glasses and taps them sort of angrily at Sophia throughout the opera. And they both sort of are drawn from Sophia's memories of her mother, but also the sound that they create has this purity that sort of resembles the sound of the voice of her sister, Emma. So I was trying to find as many ways as possible to link both the visual aspects of the instruments and the sounds to things that might have existed in her mind. I think the one other, maybe the thing that I love and sometimes get frustrated about with the instruments is that there is this, because they're using these everyday objects, there's an element of instability in the way that they create sound. They're not finely tuned, instruments with 400-year histories, and we have them electronically controlled, so I can generate sound across the whole stage. And they have all these 3D printed parts, and but despite the fact that they're electronically controlled, they're generating sound in very purely acoustic ways, the type of rubbing a wine glass, that effect, or by putting a little a rod into a bike wheel and getting different rhythms and sounds from that whirring. So when I hit a button to start a sound, I know about what will happen, but not totally. And part of the joy and challenge of writing for it, for me, was to try to figure out ways of making that okay in the piece. And for me, it felt like the way that our minds work. I think particularly our minds as children, but I think all of our minds, is that there's all this information there, but when you try to access one part of it or one memory, sometimes all of it will come out, or a lot of it will come out, but sometimes only one piece of it will come out. Or sometimes something surprising will happen that you didn't quite expect when your mind is firing on all cylinders. So the instruments act a little bit in that way.
Yeah, I've listened to a little bit of music on, from what I have available to do my research in order to meet with you tonight. But I wonder if you can talk about because everything that we ever hear, it's both unique and original, and then it's also like connected, related. It's in a kind of family tree of other human sounds and I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just like those artistic influences, just like where those sounds come from, why that feeling or that sensibility, why you chose that out of all the different experiences that you've had up to this point.
Are you thinking of specific musical influences or
musical
sounds?
Influences? But like you talked about just kind of almost like an inventor's sensibility, but there may be other ways in which you're influenced, not just by particular composers, for instance, or particular musical forms.
Yeah, I think the short and unfortunate answer to that is I'm not certain. Because I think there are certain things that I've always been drawn to. I've been, drawn to Estonian music. That's sort of, where my mother's from, and both contemporary Estonian music and older music. And I really grew up with classical music. My dad sort of outside chopping wood, listening to opera. But I think it's hard to know exactly what. It's hard to say one-to-one, oh, I can understand how this has influenced me today. I think as artists, we are constantly making all sorts of little choices about what we like and don't like. And it's the end result of that will end up ultimately becoming our own style.
Right.
I think one maybe slightly more specific thing is that a lot of the music in the piece sort of comes from the attempt to combine the world of the sound sculptures with the world of more traditional instruments with a string quartet. And it's sort of the attempt to solve that problem of how to make these sounds match together. There's also a third element in the piece is the music box that I mentioned before. And it's a very important role in the piece. And for the opera, I composed a little melody for the music box and bought a music box that was supposed to play Strauss, but I then sent it away to a music box maker in Vermont who sort of adjusted it to play my own melody. So the intersection of those three, the instruments, the traditional instruments, the created instruments, and then the music box is sort of where the sound world of the piece.
I love that you made your own music box. That's wonderful. I mean, there's so much creativity here. And I get the sense too, that just to connect those things, you have to almost build the scaffolding between them, or the bridge that connects them. So I preached on Sunday at St. John the Divine Cathedral in New York City. And it was only like about 2 hours afterwards, I'm like, you know what? That was a lot like the preacher Friedrich Buechner, who's just a preacher in the 60s who I really admired. And I just didn't even realize it. I wasn't thinking about it as I wrote the sermon. I wasn't thinking about it as I delivered it. But about 2 hours afterwards, I'm like, oh yeah, that's a little bit like what he did. When you look at this work, are you yet to the point where you can say, oh yeah, this reminds me a little bit of something else?
Probably if I thought about it for a moment, I'd have an answer. But
if you'd asked me right after the sermon, I was like, I don't know what it sounded like. It was just it. But it was like 2 hours later, it just kind of clicked for me. So maybe it's in the process of clicking for you too.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I'll check in with me again in 10 minutes.
All right. Well, you have to promise us that when that light bulb comes on, no matter what's happening, you will interrupt us and tell us what came through.
Sounds good.
The last question I had, just especially for you, is just maybe you could describe your creative process a little bit for how things like this come into the world for you. Like, do you sit down with a piano, with a pencil and paper? Do you go for a walk? Like, what's the beginning of this process that ultimately creates something like Sophia's Forest?
I guess the beginning is imagining and making time to imagine with intent to I think to be away from instruments and just try to hear what I can hear in my mind and start thinking about anything, plot, emotion, character, anything that really grabs me. And it could be any one of these things. But then the real element is collaboration.
Yeah.
So it's I find when I'm working with people, I always want people to tell me what they feel most strongly about, and that's the way I begin. And it's sometimes I've worked with this librettist Hannah Moscovich a number of times, and I'll sort of laugh because I often give her these very strange little collections of bits. I knew for this project that I thought, okay, I want some sort of tree or that makes sound, and there's something about coming to America, a girl using her imagination. And then she'd looking back on things, and that's about all that I gave her. And then it's this process of working with her, working with engineer collaborators, and then working later with the piano and trying to figuring out some more music. That wonderful process of bouncing ideas around that creates a piece. But those first few little points of energy that you feel really excited about feel really important to me, but then they'll only take you a little bit of the way. And then it's a process of trying to bounce those things off other people and other tools.
Yeah, I've definitely felt like this is such a team project for sure, but I definitely wanted to hear about the little seed where it began. Indre, thanks so much for joining us today. I'm so grateful that you agreed to be on the program. I've been thinking so much about your work. I mean, and just what the path was that led you to being both a scientist and an opera director. I mean, those two, that in the Venn diagram that includes, both those, the little circle that they both share in common, and the little oval is so small. And maybe you can talk a little bit about just how your path led you to this place.
Sure. And I will say there's a big chunk of time where I was an opera singer before I became a director, which was kind of a key time. Lembit, I was just resonating with what you were saying. My mom was born in Lithuania in 1942 and had a very similar experience. So I totally get where you're coming from. And, that's sort of relevant, Malcolm, to your question as well, because I grew up as a child of immigrants in Canada. And there was both a real love and joy of singing. My mom's a choral conductor, and an understanding that you simply can't make a living as an artist, because they came from a place where, my grandfather was a judge in Lithuania, and he spent his time in Canada washing cars or working at a Labatt's brewery. So he wished he had a kind of trade or a skill that, would be transferable anywhere. And so when I showed some propensity towards the sciences, it was very clear you need to go to medicine, because people always get sick, no matter where you are, no matter what the situation is, people will get sick and you will be needed, which I thought was really ironic given how important art, I think, is, especially in terms of healing from trauma. But in any case, so I had these two parts of, my education and my passion. I discovered the writings of Oliver Sacks in high school, who's just this amazing neurologist. And I started getting really excited about the brain. And so instead of medicine, I thought, well, maybe I could go into psychology. I could do research about the brain. That was becoming a really, big exploding field. And maybe that would still leave me time to sing and time to, if I was going to medical school, I wouldn't be sleeping, let alone singing. But maybe if I did research, I'd still find time to sing. And so throughout my PhD, I continued to train. I had, coachings and lessons every week. The summers I would spend in Europe at young artist programs. And then after I finished my PhD, I decided that I finally had the courage to just devote everything I had to music. And even though I wasn't sure, how I could support myself as a musician, I felt like I had the PhD I could fall back on if I needed to.
Right.
So I enrolled at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music in a voice degree, and actually met Nicole there, and had a really enlightening experience. I also had the opportunity to work with some living composers, and that really just changed my view of what I wanted to do as a singer. And then I spent, probably a decade gigging as a singer, but also, thinking about other ways in which I could use my neuroscience knowledge. And I started to put the two together slowly, thinking about how, understanding, because my PhD was in learning and memory, understanding how the brain learns and remembers. Well, maybe I could find a way that would make me more effective in the practice room. And so, how could I apply the neuroscience of learning to develop more effective practice strategies? And I started working that way. And then ultimately, I came to directing because I realized that was a place where I could put all of these skills together, because, understanding how the audience will, experience a piece, understanding how to, you get your singers to give their most honest performances, understanding to how to, help your design team be as creative as possible. I felt like finally I could put everything, all my passion of opera, into one skill set. So that was the journey.
Oh, I love it. I still love it. I wonder how opera helps you be a better scientist. And you've talked a little bit about how being a scientist can help you be a better director.
Yeah, so I mean, I actually think that a lot of the really interesting questions to me in terms of science come from artists. I like to say that artists and scientists ultimately have the same goal. We want to understand the human experience. We just use different methods. So scientists, use an objective approach to see what's universal, what general principles we can extract from everyone. But artists use their individual experiences to illuminate also what's universal. And so a lot of times when I get stuck, in the lab, or when I'm thinking about like, what is it scientifically that I either want to communicate to people? How do I explain to people this one, fact about the brain? Or, what should I do next in the lab in terms of, studying, because I study creativity in the lab. It's always, well, let's look at what an artist did, or let's take a personal story and how do I actually, delve into some deep experience that a person has had or has explained, and use that as the muse, or, the way of really making sure that the questions I'm asking are the big questions and not just incremental knowledge gains, which are important too, but which just aren't my forte as a scientist.
Yeah, I think I was just talking to someone who's doing a PhD in theology 2 nights ago. He's at Fordham University and doing something on Black studies, queer studies, and theology altogether. And we're just talking about just how unpredictable, like what direction scientific and theological and philosophical advances are going to take. But from my perspective, I mean, just the invention of these machines that can do brain scans in ways that we could only dream of in like 1982. They've really changed our understanding of how the human brain functions. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just what we learned as a result of those new technologies, and just, as we get further down the road, what does it look like now that we look back at those technologies and how they've changed human self-understanding?
I think one of the biggest things that we've learned is that if you don't understand the behavior, or why it's meaningful that the person is doing the thing they're doing, it doesn't matter what's going on in the brain. There was like also this huge false promise of neuroimaging. Like what's the part of the brain that underlies spirituality? Oh, well, it's this nodule.
The whole
but that's
thing.
not at all interesting, right? Like, who cares if that doesn't tell you something about what it means to the person?
Right.
But I think now we're getting much better at asking much more interesting questions, and then using the tools to, as an additional tool, but really focusing too on understanding the behavior and understanding what's underlying, that particular human thing. But I will say that lately, I feel like the neuroimaging tools have started to provide us with some more and more interesting insights. And I'll give you one that I think might actually relate a little bit to the opera. We've learned that, when you put somebody in a neuroimaging scanner, usually you ask them to do something like, can you think about some childhood memory? Right. And you look at what's happening in the brain when they're doing that versus some other condition, like, just rest and close your eyes, or, think about what might have happened to somebody else, could be a good control. And then we compare, and then we can say, aha, well, this network in the brain is involved in remembering what it's like, to be a child. But what we learned is that when we were asking the people just to do nothing, turns out they're really active. And they're really active in really interesting ways. We tend to ruminate about ourselves. We tend to, think about our past, or, imagine our future, or worry about something that's bothered us, a conversation we had with somebody that didn't go as well as we wanted to, et cetera. And so there's this network of brain regions called the default mode network that is slightly different in different people, but that also changes with different experiences. And then there are ways in which trauma can interact with these several networks of our brains that coordinate activity between regions. And so one example is that when you go through a traumatic experience or something that's highly stressful, the parts of your brain that really are involved in your fight or flight response that, generate anxiety, that are important, because when something bad happens, you want to make sure you're not in the situation again. So you want to remember the context of that situation. And you don't want to remember sort of, the sort of philosophical details that, you don't have time to consider if you find yourself in that situation again, right? So we tend to see more of these parts of the brain that kind of are from emotional networks that kind of hijack our more rational, deliberate thinking system. And so it becomes harder to do the things that, we need to do in a modern world to be successful, to, strategize and make plans and set goals and meet those goals, et cetera. And instead it becomes this kind of, you just have this like stress response that then you're dealing with all the time. And it really changes this sort of the way that your brain just functions. And so, we could talk forever about this, but, we're learning more and more about the effects of trauma, how individualized they are, how different people, react to trauma in different ways, and how, trauma has different effects in different times of life, but it also has a kind of cumulative and additive effect. And everyone who's gone through the pandemic probably realizes this. At the very beginning, you get overwhelmed by the highly stressful event and you just can't even think straight. I mean, we all kind of, when we went into lockdown, I think just really had this, we just couldn't function. And then you develop a resilience and you develop this kind of, response. And actually, you're sometimes you're even more energized. You're able to do things that you wouldn't have otherwise, especially if you're like in a adrenaline rush. Think about people in the war who did all kinds of superhuman feats, or people still do, Afghani refugees, are still going through these superhuman things that they're doing. And then as the pandemic wears on, we get exhausted and our resilience goes down again. And now any tiny little thing can be overwhelming. All of a sudden it becomes, you get to the state of exhaustion. And of course, that is going to have a signature ultimately, in terms of how your brain works.
Oh, so interesting. We had Robert Sapolsky as one of our forum guests, and the number of times that YouTube video gets viewed every day, it astonishes me. I think people, as human beings, we want to understand ourselves better. And some of what he talked about was just kind of almost the sociological effects of those traumas. So talking about just how race or socioeconomic status, like what we can learn about those from kind of a neuroscience perspective, but a very, very interesting project. You talked a little bit about just how being a neuroscientist has helped you in terms of just practice and performance, working with artists in terms of helping them to be more effective in their preparation for the performances. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the audiences, when you go into a production, what are you learning from your scientific background that's helping to kind of influence the experience that your audience is having of the production?
Yeah, so there are a number of different ways. They range from the purely perceptual. I mean, understanding our sensory system is really helpful when you're trying to light a show or you're trying to, create an acoustic. But also just in terms of the very human desire to learn something new and to find meaning in it. So, if what you're trying to do on stage is not reading for the audience because you haven't signposted it enough, or you haven't left enough breadcrumbs that the audience can't follow the meaning that you're trying to imbue, it's not going to be successful. But making it too obvious and taking the sense of agency away from the audience also is not that interesting. The audience then finds themselves observers, but not part of, the action. But the sort of sweet spot of getting people invested in the story. And I'm very much about, story and kind of, making sure that there's an emotional journey that we're taking our audience on through the characters, that, that they become invested in that. And then, all of a sudden they can find all of these ways in which they relate, but also they have an emotional cathartic moment, which to me is really the joy of opera in particular. One of the reasons why music is such an effective tool to help us work through trauma is because it allows us to have very deep emotions in a safe space.
Yeah.
We know as the audience that we can get up and leave. This is not our reality. And yet we need to process these feelings, probably either because we have our own traumas or because we want to empathize. I think there is a deep human-seated desire to empathize with others, to connect with others, to feel compassion. And so the theater gives you that space, and the audience has come to you, right? That they have chosen to come and go on this emotional journey. And so it's a real gift. So that's kind of how I feel like I try as a director, and I'm not always successful, but I try very hard to sort of use my understanding of both this human desire to find emotional meaning and to connect with what's going on stage and relate that to yourself, but also maintain a sense of being a participant in the process, rather than, an observer that doesn't matter.
I love what you just said. It's just totally, is it going to help me be a better preacher? You're so right. People want to learn. They want to be improved. They want to be, they want to have an experience of meaning. And you're right. You can't just give it to them all just like completely baked together. They need to feel like they're participating in this project and not, just taking everything in a non-dialogical kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
Those are really cool things. Those are great insights from somebody who has, those two backgrounds. Thank you very much, Indre. That was really helpful.
It was my pleasure.
Malaak, thank you so much for being on the program tonight. It's such a pleasure to have you tonight, and we're very grateful that you came to talk about this. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just your own personal experience and just your connection to kind of the themes we've been talking about with regard to the opera.
Thank you so much for having me. My experience is very much aligned with your families, except that I was the one who escaped from Afghanistan. It was 1979, and at the age of 6, my family and I had a horrific escape out of the country into Pakistan. The first time that we tried to escape, we were captured and sent back home. And so we did it twice. So we did it a second time. And, as a child, you find different ways of coping. And my way was just to bury everything very deep inside and not even connect at all with my story. I remember in 6th grade writing my story because my teacher asked me to, and it was just like I was writing someone else's story. It wasn't until I was in my 30s when I watched during the refugee crisis in like 2013 when the Kurdish boy was washed up, on a beach. And that image was the first time that I saw myself as a refugee, as someone who has escaped war, and all of those feelings surfaced for me at once. Part of our journey while we were escaping, like many refugees, we had smugglers who were ill-equipped to actually get us across the country, across the border. We're a family of 5, and my 2 other family members were with us. I was the oldest at the age of 6. My youngest brother was 2, and they told us it would take about a day and a half to cross the border, and that we would be in a bus or some type of vehicle. It ended up taking 5 days, and so we only had enough supplies, basic essentials for, a day and a half, maybe 2 days. So by the time we arrived in Pakistan, after losing my sister along the way and then finding her. And, you know, my brother was in diapers. It was 5 days. We reached the border looking, you know, horrible, and asking to be let into this country. And all those images that I have, that just pieces of it, just frames of it, were really fragmented. And through my healing is my work that I'm doing in refugee advocacy, refugee and immigrant advocacy, putting those pieces together, so that I'm not as afraid of them, and so that I could live through this experience and give back. And so I could say that I've lived, you know, through some of what your families lived through, the good and the bad.
Yeah, I wonder too. I mean, I just think of Lembit talking about his conversations with his mother, and I just wonder. I mean, you're right. When you're 6 years old, you remember like little snapshots of things, and you're not really equipped to know how the adult world works or how everything fits together. And I wonder just what your experience has been like, just talking to your other family members about this, especially your parents. Like, how have they helped you to understand what happened, and to try to heal from it? Have they been able to be helpful, or are they just too wounded by this experience to be able to be helpful in guiding you?
That's a great question, and the answer is multifaceted. Everybody has a different response, and they've become a different person from the trauma. Every time we sit and tell stories, there's a new thing unfolds, and I'm like, why didn't you tell me that, you know, all these years? And it's, you know, a memory that they may have blocked, but feel comfortable with bringing out. I can say that, like, my family helped me in the sense of giving me community and love and protection, but we're all healing in our own ways at different times, and not everybody is in a good place. On the outside, you know, we may look fine and can carry on through our day, but on the inside, it's very different for each one of us. And I think what Lembit's music, having the different sounds and the different, not knowing how the sound is going to reflect all the time, it's a great parallel to what goes on in my mind as well. And so that really resonated with me.
Yeah, I can imagine. There are probably just moments when just like Lembit describing, just moments of memory, moments of clarity, moments of being brought back to that place. I wonder if you can talk just a little bit about. I mean, there's so many things. Like, if I ever ask you a question in any time in our life together that you don't want to answer, just let me know, because I know that this is a sensitive topic. But could you talk a little bit about just how you began to just kind of start to feel like you were okay again? Like, when did the healing really begin, and what did it feel like as you kind of turned the corner?
It's hard to pinpoint when the healing began. I think that when I started to understand, you know, I was in therapy to try to understand why I felt the way I did about certain things, and understanding being able to separate myself and my experiences from somebody else's experiences really helped me, by compartmentalizing, understanding that my journey and my feelings are separate from others, and this is my own journey, and it's okay that I'm on this journey. I think that was the first step in you know, looking forward and not being stuck where I was. I still, you know, it's very easy, even though I feel like I've accomplished so much healing, it's very easy to go backwards when, you know, in my work, I'm working with, you know, refugees, with families who are separated, dealing with, you know, the legal aspects of what's happening, and it's easy to get pulled back into that, and, you know, we call it secondary trauma in my field, and so it's a recurring thing. I think that even had I not been chosen this path, for my career and work, I would still connect with, just as Dr. Viskontas mentioned, when you go in to listen to music and you're in this arena, you're choosing to put yourself through there and empathize. And so I by choice am going in and getting, traumatized by the experience again. I don't know that we ever completely heal. It's a journey for sure.
Yeah. I wonder if you can, the last 6 months must have been just horrendous. In terms of bringing back those childhood experiences, but I wonder if you can just help us. There may be things just about what's been happening in Afghanistan over the last 6 months that Americans just don't understand. You are going to understand, like when you see a news broadcast or read an article in the newspaper, you're going to bring to it so much more than an ordinary American. Can you talk a little bit about just what it is that Americans may have a hard time understanding, or that may not be so obvious just from reading the newspapers?
Yes. The U.S. went to Afghanistan because of 9/11. And it was, the promise was to clear an act of terrorism that happened in the U.S. But bin Laden was not Afghan. None of the terrorists who attacked our country were Afghan. And there was a promise made that, we're going to fight, on your land, and we're going to bring democracy with us. And we're going to do this together. The way that we left the country was very careless, in my opinion, in many people's opinion, because these 20 years of building these allegiances and alliances with the Afghans living there, you can see it in the way that the veterans are reacting. They feel destroyed that this is happening, that we chose to leave the way that we left, to leave thousands behind who are on, Taliban target lists and are being hunted daily because of the biometrics information that was left there. The Afghans that did leave, some came just by themselves without their families, with the promise that, your family will come too. All the assets are frozen still in the central bank of Afghanistan, so they came with nothing. The assets that are frozen at the central bank in Afghanistan, those are it's not just like the UN money, it's people's money that they go and deposit into a bank, and we have those assets frozen. So now these people are here. Sometimes they're on the military bases for 5-6 months, and it's just a holding pattern. When they're given 2 years to apply for a visa, and in that first year, they're supposed to apply for asylum, but the first 5 or 6 months, they're in a holding pattern on a military base, so they only have maybe 4 or 5 months to do that, to apply. And then there's not enough legal aid in trying to get those applications. So one of the most important things right now is the Afghan Adjustment Act, which will give Afghans that are humanitarian parole access to becoming asylees. The housing is the number one issue, which is why people are on the bases for so long. It's been really difficult to access housing. And there's been a tremendous amount of effort and success, in achieving it by so many different people and groups and organizations. We have such a long road ahead, and there's still another 34,000 Afghans who are in what we call lily pad countries, still waiting to arrive.
Yeah, our church has been involved in helping some refugees to relocate, and what we hear from the State Department is just that the Bay Area is so expensive, but there's so many Afghans who are already here. It makes so sense to move them here, but then the cost of living issue becomes very important. Thank you so much. That was an extraordinary answer. I think all of us feel just built up by what you were able to say, and and it does help us to understand what was going on and what still is continuing to go on. So thank you for your bravery and your courage and your ability to articulate these very difficult ideas. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
You know, one of the traditions we have on the forum is we actually, when we're in person, we take questions. So people write down little questions on their notepads or on little note cards, and then we read the questions. So I'm inviting anybody to ask questions. But I was wondering if you had any questions for each other, as you each have worked on different aspects of this project of art and culture and science and just children and refugees. And I mean, here we are, all are four of us. All of none of our mothers were born in America. So we're all had to kind of learn American culture. We have a little, you know, we've learned as children to be kind of try not to be weird like our parents were weird. But I wonder if you have questions for each other. And I just wonder too, what your lives were like growing up too, and as you tried to adjust to this American culture. When I first became a priest, I had to decide whether I was going to say things the way my mother said things, or whether I was going to try to sound like a good American. And so that's what I did. I was like, everything 100% American. Lembit, is there any parts of the performance that's coming up that you're nervous about? Like, or do you feel like things are equally coming together? Like, are you worried about, you know, how the music's going to be, or whether people are going to be able to learn their lines, or whether the sound is going to work in the cathedral, or what are you thinking of just as you get closer to the day that we actually perform this work?
I guess I'm thinking, I'm really looking forward to being in Grace Cathedral, in that space, partly because it's a little bit of an unknown. I mean, it's interesting that a cathedral brings with it so many, I think for people individually, it brings so many connotations that's hard to predict. Yes. But it's without a doubt a powerful and imposing place. So the way that
I'll tell you a little, this is a little anecdote that you may find helpful or not, but we were, you know, we have Litquake in San Francisco. And so we always have poetry readings in the cathedral. And a woman came up to me and she said, "Is there anything I can't say?" You know, like 4-letter words and things, like talk about things. And my first response is, no, you know, this is a free space. It should be open to everybody. But there is a way in which the building kind of fights against you if it's going to be something that's going to, do you know what I mean? There's certain topics and certain ideas where you just don't feel like the building is like amplifying it. And there's ways in which there's certain things where it just totally amplifies. One of the poets was talking about like oral sex in Grace Cathedral. And I know that like if we're in a small club, it would have a totally different feeling. But in Grace Cathedral, there's a way in which she was being undermined by just like the architecture of the setting that she was in.
I think it's exactly the same with music. And it's partly an acoustic issue, of course, of the way that affects the way you hear music. But there's also just, I guess, an aesthetic issue. And I find if I'm in an art museum, I want to hear and I want to write very different sort of music. I think one thing, I think this applies to storytelling as well. And I think one thing I'm really looking forward to is the way that this type of story that's intimate, but in many ways universal, will feel in a space where you don't quite expect to see that sort of story.
Yeah, definitely.
And you know, I was gonna jump in and say that you're exactly right that the context changes everything, not just the acoustic, but just also what the expectations are of the audience and how, just how their minds work. We're as neuroscientists and especially during the pandemic, just as a society, we become so enamored with this idea that our minds are just, encased inside our heads, and they can, they're just like boxes on a screen. That's all we need. We can do everything we need to do on this little box. But the truth is that your mind functions very differently in different settings. There are times where, you just can't even think of a word that you've said 1 million times in a particular context because of the context. Or you take a walk out in nature and all of a sudden creativity flows when it didn't, when that same brain was encased in that same skull, in that room that you've spent 2 years. So, I mean, it doesn't surprise me. I would think there are very specific ways in which Grace Cathedral, in particular, would have would both, enhance, but also put a boundary around, the person's experience of the piece. And, I think that's really interesting. And I think, as Nicole mentioned at the beginning, that was a strategic choice. And, I love the fact that, we can now create music in many different spaces and use the space as a strategy for, how we're going to sort of shape the audience's experience.
So Malaak was so articulate and so beautiful in her story, which it just made me feel so connected to all four of you at once. And Indre, I wonder if you can talk about any artistic projects you've had that kind of that had that healing element in it for the audience. You may not have had anything like that, but I wonder if there's a similar project that you had which had that hope for healing kind of embedded in it.
Yeah, so the very first opera I directed on my own was Michael Nyman's The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, which was based on the Oliver Sacks
book.
Tale, right? And it was a real, it was a really personal story for me, in part because it really talks about an individual who has a specific form of Alzheimer's disease, and essentially starts to misrecognize objects, which is often an unknown presentation of Alzheimer's disease. And there are a number of reasons why this was important to me. But one was that, my grandmother died of Alzheimer's disease. And also, I had a chance to work with Oliver on a case. And so all of this stuff came together, and I felt like I had the opportunity to show the audience this other face of dementia, lead them through this experience. And it was healing because I had so many people afterwards come up to me and tell me that it had validated their experience with a loved one who had dementia, which didn't seem to fit the classical model. And all of a sudden they felt like they understood, what was happening a little bit better. And of course, the role that music can play, because what's really wonderful about music is that when there's so many different ways in which music is represented in the brain, that even when you have pretty severe degeneration, and certainly in Alzheimer's disease, the parts of the brain that are involved in especially familiar music tend to be retained. And so when a person can no longer speak, you can still connect with them by sharing a musical experience. And so to me, that's really powerful and really healing when, you're faced with this situation where you're watching the mind of a loved one disintegrate. And yet when you can have that moment, when you can share that spark in their eye by going on the same emotional journey at the same time through a musical piece, I mean, the person's right back there with you. And actually, it turns out it makes their cognition better too.
I've had that exact experience of being in the veterans hospital and singing a familiar hymn with someone who otherwise seemed to be unable to communicate or speak. And you're right. I mean, it's incredible sense of connection and power. Malaak, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about stories that may have helped you or sustained you just as an immigrant and as a refugee. Maybe there were stories you saw in film, in a Disney movie, or a book that you read, or literature or other forms of culture. What kind of stories have helped you in the process of healing?
One of the things that I thought of earlier in our conversation about, people seeking empathy, to feel empathy, I would always gravitate towards books where, I loved Helen Keller. I just read every book that I could about her. I even tried to learn Braille because her experience and her struggle was just very, I was very intrigued by it. Anne Frank was another one, although I never connected myself to her story at the ages neither of them at the ages that I was reading about them. Music has been the center of my community. Listening to Afghan music. I grew up listening to it. My parents loved music. We came from Afghanistan at a time where, there weren't all these laws against banning music and dancing, and a lot of my family plays live instruments, and so every weekend, sometimes 2 or 3 nights a week, we would sit around and have live music. Every generation would be there. And looking back at it as an adult, it was a way for my family to, behind these closed doors, they all speak the right language. They all know the rules. They all know the customs, and every sound is familiar, and you get to have that familiarity. It was like a cocoon for them, because we would say, this is a lot of parties. We didn't understand why there was this attraction for so many gatherings. And I know now that it's their way of going back home, being somewhere familiar and not being lost, not understanding the language, not miscommunicating. My biggest pet peeve is miscommunication, and I think it stems from my childhood, not being understood, and watching my parents not being understood, and then my parents not understanding the negative reactions they were getting. They had no idea, but we learned the language a lot quicker and picked up a lot quicker than my parents did. And initially being embarrassed by it, and then understanding it, and then becoming angry about it. And I think that anger is what fuels me to make a difference, to when I see anyone who is lost or confused or just different, I make it a point. And somebody in the Q&A asked, what can we do to make people feel more welcome? And I would say to just approach them and just give a smile. It's universal, right? Just to include them in your day and ask them how they're doing. When we come to this country, we're considered aliens. We get alien identification cards, and believe me, that's how we feel. And that's also how we feel that we are looked at, as this alien. And so if you could make us feel less like an alien and more like everyone else, that would be the best thing.
The three of you have such beautiful souls, and I'm so grateful for your generosity of spirit and sharing yourselves tonight in such a deep way. So thank you very much for being our guests, and I'm looking forward very much to Sophia's feast next week. I can't wait. Sophia's forest. I keep saying that because I'm hungry, and Indre totally understands. She's like, there's like a neuroscientific reason why I keep making that same mistake. But yeah, Sophia's forest next week at Grace Cathedral. I hope to see all of you in person, not just on an electronic medium. But thank you so much for being part of our conversation tonight.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all so much.
Please join me on Sunday, February 20th. It's going to be our first in-person forum since March of 2020. My guest will be John Philip Newell, and we'll be talking about his latest book, Sacred Earth, Sacred Soul, and how his earth-based spirituality can help us rediscover our connection with God, with each other, and with the earth. We rely on your support for the forum. Gifts of any size make a difference. You can give on gracecathedral.org or by texting THINK, THINK, to 76278. And thanks again to Lembit, Indre, Malaak, and you for joining us tonight. Good night and stay well, everybody.